I had not spoken my wife's name out loud in 2 years, and I would have told you, if you'd been fool enough to ask, that I never meant to again. That was the kind of man I'd become by the autumn the new schoolteacher stepped off the noon stage in Mercy Bend. Hard as a hitching post and about as warm. I had a ranch out on Coldwater Creek, 140 head of cattle, 2 children I loved more than my own breath, and not one earthly idea of how to be a father to them since the fever took their mother. I rose before light, I worked till I couldn't see, and I went to bed so tired I didn't have to lie awake and think. That was my whole plan for the rest of my life. It was a coward's plan, and it was working fine. My name is Eli Hartwell, and I am old now, old enough to tell this the way it happened and not the way pride would have me tell it. The boy I was at 36 is a stranger to me. I look back at him and I want to take him by the collar and shake him, and then I want to put a hand on his shoulder, because Lord, he was hurting, and he didn't have the first notion how to set it down. I'll start with the day she came, because that's where everything I had built so carefully began to come apart, and a good thing too. It was a bright cold day in late September, the cottonwoods along the creek already going to gold. I'd hauled a wagon load of feed into town, and I was loading the last of the flour and coffee when the stage came rattling in on the Drybone Road, all dust and rocking leather. I didn't pay it any mind. Strangers came and went through Mercy Bend the way water goes through a sieve. But my daughter Lucy, who was 6 that year and had a head full of curls her mother used to brush, and I could never get a comb through, my Lucy let go of the wagon wheel and ran straight out into the middle of the street to watch. "Lucy," I said, "get back here." She didn't. She stood there with her thumb in her mouth, which she'd taken up again after Margaret died and which I'd given up trying to break her of, and she watched a woman climb down out of that stage like she'd never seen a person do it before. The woman was tall and plain dressed in dark gray, a traveling coat dusty at the hem, and she carried herself straight as a fence post. Not pretty in the way the saloon girls down at the Lucky Bell were pretty. Something quieter than that. She had a face that looked like it had decided things, if you take my meaning. A face that had made up its mind about something and gone ahead and done it. She set down a carpetbag and a small trunk, and she looked up and down our one street with its false front stores and its mud and its single church, and she didn't flinch. A lot of folks flinched, coming to Mercy Bend from back east. She just took it in, like she was reading a page. Then she looked down and found my Lucy staring up at her, thumb and all. I came across the street fast to fetch my girl, the way you do, half embarrassed. But before I got there, the woman had crouched down in the dust in her good coat, right down to Lucy's height, and was saying something to her, low. And Lucy, who hadn't talked to a stranger willingly since the fever, who hid behind my leg at church and wouldn't say boo to the preacher, my Lucy took her thumb out of her mouth and answered. "That's far enough, mister," the woman said, not unkindly when she heard my boots. She stood up. She had clear gray eyes and she looked right at me. "Unless this is your daughter." "She is," I said. "Lucy, come on now." She was telling me about the schoolhouse. The woman put out her hand to shake like a man would. "I'm Nora Vance. I expect I'm the reason she's interested. I'm to be your new teacher if Mercy Bend will have me." I shook her hand. It was a firm, dry grip, no nonsense in it. "Eli Hartwell," I said, "Coldwater Creek." And then, because I am not a man who knows what to say to women, I said, "We've been wanting a teacher," and picked up my daughter and walked off without another word. I have thought about that a great deal since. How I turned my back on the best thing that ever rode into that town and walked away, and patted myself on the back for being so brisk about it. In the wagon going home, Lucy was quiet a long while, watching the road. My son Sam was up front with me, 10 years old and trying so hard to be a man that it broke what was left of my heart. Then Lucy said, from the bed of the wagon where she rode among the flour sacks, "Pa, that lady is going to teach me my letters." "Is she?" I said. "She said anybody can learn anything if they want to bad enough. She said she taught a boy with one arm to write better than the boys with two." "Did she?" Pa, Lucy said. She smiled at me, like a real one. I didn't answer that. I clucked to the horses. But Sam looked at me, sidelong, the way he'd taken to doing, watchful, like he was always waiting to catch me about to crack, and I kept my eyes on the road. You have to understand about Margaret. We married young, back in Ohio, and we came west with everything we owned in one wagon and our whole future in our heads. We built the place at Coldwater Creek with our own hands. She picked the spot. She said the cottonwoods made it look gentled, even when the country around it wasn't gentle at all. She had Sam in the back bedroom with no doctor for 40 miles and the midwife 3 hours late, and she never made a sound I could hear, and afterward she laughed at how scared I'd been. She had Lucy the same way. She made that hard country into a home. She had a way of singing while she worked low, like she didn't know she was doing it, and I'd be out in the corral and I'd hear it come drifting through the kitchen window, and I'd think, well, here's a man who got everything he ever wanted and most of what he didn't deserve. Then there was a winter the fever came up the valley, and it took old Mrs. Prout and the Daltons' baby and 2 of the hands down at the Skillet Ranch, and it took Margaret in 9 days. 9 days. I had thought a thing like that would take longer, would give a man time. It didn't. She was gone before I'd finished believing she could be. And I want to tell you what I did wrong because it's the whole of this story. I didn't fall apart. I wish to God I had. A man who falls apart can be put back together. What I did was the other thing. I packed it all down so hard and so deep that I turned a stone over the top of it. I never cried where the children could see. I never spoke her name because I found that if I said Margaret out loud, my chest did a thing I couldn't allow, not with cattle to run and 2 bobbies to feed. So I quit saying it. I took down the one photograph and put it in a drawer. I worked. I provided. The children had food and clothes and a roof, and I told myself that was love, and maybe it was, but it was love with the warmth taken out of it. Love gone cold and dutiful, and a child can't get warm by such a fire. By that September, 2 years on, Sam had got quiet and careful and old before his time, and Lucy sucked her thumb and wouldn't speak to strangers, and I went around inside my own life like a hired man who'd lost the keys to the house. That was the man Nora Vance found. She took a room over the dry goods store, and she opened the school the first Monday of October. We were 31 children scattered across that whole basin, from the freight families in town to the ranch kids who rode in double on old plow horses, and she taught every one of them in a single room with a stove that smoked and a row of windows that rattled in the wind. I'd hear about her from the other men at the feed store. Tom Skillet said his boys came home and washed their own faces now without being told, on account of Miss Vance said a clean man thinks clean. The blacksmith said she'd faced down the McCabe twins, who were near grown and meaner than a wet cat, and had them carrying in firewood for the little ones by the end of the first week, and proud to do it. Folks took to her. She was firm, but she was fair, and she had no fear in her that anybody could find, and out here that's the coin of the realm. My 2 went 5 days a week, rain or shine. I put them up on the gentle mare together, and Sam rode her in and tied her at the schoolyard, and they walked the last bit, and I told myself I was a fine provider for arranging it. What I was a man who'd found a way to have his children gone all day so the house stayed quiet. The first time I really spoke to her again, beyond a nod at church, was in November, and it was because Lucy got sick. Not bad sick, a cough and a fever, the kind children get. But the moment I felt the heat coming off her forehead, my whole body went to ice, because the last time I'd felt that under my hand it had been Margaret, and I had stood in that same kitchen useless as a post, while the woman I loved burned down to nothing. I kept Lucy home 3 days. I sat up 2 nights with her, and on the 3rd afternoon there came a knock at the door, and it was Nora Vance, having ridden 4 miles out from town on a hired horse, with a basket on her arm. "She's been absent," Nora said, standing on my porch with the cold coming off her coat. "I came to see if she needed her lessons brought, and to see if she needed anything else." "She's got a fever," I said. I stood in the door and didn't move out of it. I don't know what I thought I was guarding. We're managing. Nora looked at me a moment. I have wondered since what she saw. A big unshaven man with a dirty apron tied on over his work clothes. I'd been trying to make broth and circles under his eyes, and a house behind him that I knew, even as I stood there, smelled of wood smoke and dirty dishes and a child's sickness and no woman's hand at all. I made too much soup, she said, which I would later learn was the kind of lie she told, the useful kind. I'd be obliged if you take some off me before it spoils. And somehow she was past me and in the kitchen, not pushing, just moving, the way water finds the low ground. She had her coat off and her sleeves up before I'd shut the door. She felt Lucy's head with the back of her hand, calm, and she said, "They're now to my daughter the way you'd say it to settle a colt," and she had that child, who'd been fretful and crying for 2 days, half asleep and easy inside 10 minutes. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, watching a stranger do in 10 minutes what I hadn't managed in 3 days, and I did not know whether I wanted to thank her or run her off the place. She stayed 2 hours. She got broth into Lucy. She found the bread I'd let go hard and made it into something with milk and a little sugar that Sam ate 3 bowls of. She didn't fuss at me or look at the dust or say one word about how we were living. When she left, the light going blue over the snow, she stopped in the yard and said, "She'll be back at her desk Monday. It's just a cold. Children are tougher than we give them credit for." "I'm obliged," I made myself say. She paused, one foot in the stirrup. "You sat up with her." "A man sits up with his child." "A great many men don't," she said. "I only mean you're doing more than you think you are, Mr. Hartwell." And she rode off into the dusk and left me standing there with that, which I didn't know what to do with, and which I carried around for a week like a stone in my boot. Now I'd be lying if I told this straight and easy. The truth is I fought her every inch and I didn't even know I was doing it. She came back. She kept coming. There was always a reason: Lucy's lessons, a book Sam might like, a question about whether the children could come to a Saturday spelling match in town. And every time she came, something in my house got a little less broke. And every time she left, I felt a kind of low burn in my chest that I told myself was nothing but a man's natural resentment at having his habits disturbed. It was Lucy who told me the truth of it, the way children do, by accident. It was December and bitter, the creek frozen and the cattle bunched in the lee of the ridge, and I'd brought the children in from the cold and was trying to get a fire built up while Lucy chattered. She'd taken a powerful shine to Miss Vance by then. Miss Vance said this and Miss Vance said that. I half listened, the way a tired man does. "Miss Vance asked me what my pa is like," Lucy said. "Did she?" I fed a stick to the fire. "I told her my pa is the strongest man in the whole valley, and he can lift a calf with one arm, and he knows where all the stars are." That brought my head up. I didn't know she thought any of that. And she said, "What else?" And I said. Lucy stopped. She'd gone quiet, and when a child like Lucy goes quiet, you'd best listen. I said, "My pa forgot how to smile." The stick was in my hand. The fire popped. "I told her you used to," Lucy said, very small, not looking at me, picking at the hem of her dress. "Sam says you used to laugh and pick me up and throw me over your shoulder. I don't 'member it, but Sam does." I told her my pa forgot how after Mama, and Miss Vance didn't say anything for a while. Then she said maybe nobody forgets, maybe they just put it away somewhere and can't find it. And I said, "Do you think somebody could help him find it?" And she said. Lucy looked up at me then, and her eyes were so much like her mother's that for a second I couldn't breathe. "She said she'd see what she could do," Lucy finished. "Was that bad, Pa, to tell her? Sam says I talk too much." I had to turn and stir the fire that didn't need stirring. I had to do something with my hands and my face for a minute. When I'd got hold of myself, I said, "No, Lucy, that wasn't bad." But it sat in me like a coal all that night. My pa forgot how to smile. I lay in the dark in the bed I'd shared with my wife, the one I'd never moved to the middle of, still sleeping on my own half like a man waiting for someone to come back. And I thought about my daughter standing in a schoolhouse telling a stranger that her father had forgot how to smile, and being right, and being so young to be right about a thing like that. I want to tell you that I rose up changed. I didn't. A man like me doesn't change in a night. He changes the way a creek cuts a canyon, a little at a time and against his will. But something started that night. A crack, the kind that lets in the first cold and later lets in the light. After that I watched her differently, Nora Vance. I'd ride into town on some made-up errand and stand across the street and watch the children spill out of that schoolhouse at the end of the day, my two among them. And I'd see her in the doorway with her hand on some little one's head. And I'd see Lucy run back and hug her around the waist before she'd come to me. And I'd see Sam, my serious, careful Sam, laughing at something one of the other boys said. Easy. The way a boy that age ought to laugh and hadn't in our house in 2 years. And I'd think she did that. She put the laugh back in my boy, and I'd feel that low burn that I finally, slowly was honest enough to name. It wasn't resentment. It was the simplest thing in the world. I was lonesome, and I was watching a good woman make my children warm, and a part of me that I had buried with Margaret had started, against all my orders, to wake up. She figured me out long before I figured out myself. I know that now. She told me, years later, that she'd known the first afternoon, the day Lucy ran into the street, known that there was a kind man somewhere down inside the stone one, because no cold man sits up 2 nights with a feverish child and then stands in his own doorway too proud to ask for help. Pride like that, she said, is just love with nowhere to go. But that was years later. At the time she gave no sign. She was patient as the seasons. She never once chased me, never once batted an eye or laid a hand on my arm, and I have come to understand that this was the truest courtship a woman ever paid a man, because she courted my children and my house and my pride, and she let me come to the rest of it on my own 2 feet, like a free man, which is the only way it would have held. I'll tell you about the Christmas, because that was when the door I'd nailed shut first came open a crack on its own. Miss Vance put on a Christmas recital at the school, the children to sing and say their pieces, the whole valley invited. I almost didn't go. The thought of sitting in a warm room full of families, with carols and candles and all of it, made me want to ride the other way and keep riding. Christmas was Margaret's. She made it out of nothing, strung popcorn and dried apples and a single orange split 3 ways and one fool song she'd sing wrong on purpose to make the children shriek. I hadn't done any of it in 2 years. I'd let Christmas be just another cold day with chores. Another thing I'd taken from them without meaning to. But Lucy had a piece to say, and Sam was to sing in the row of boys, and you don't fail to come to your children's Christmas, not even if you're me. So I scrubbed up and put on my one good coat and rode in through the snow with both of them, and we sat in that crowded schoolhouse with its smoking stove and its paper chains the children had made, and I watched. Lucy stood up in front of the whole valley, my Lucy who wouldn't speak to the preacher, and said her piece in a clear high voice without a single stumble, and at the end she found me in the crowd and her whole face lit, looking to see had I seen. And I had. And something came up in me so hard and so sudden I had to look at the floor. Then the children sang, and the last song they sang was the fool one, Margaret's song, the one she'd sing wrong on purpose. I will not pretend I didn't know how it got there. I looked up and across the room at Nora Vance standing at the side with her hands folded, watching the children and then watching me just for a second, and there was nothing in her face but a question, gentle as you please. Was that all right, or did I go too far? I couldn't answer it. My eyes had gone to water in front of the whole valley, and I sat there like a stone with the rain coming down it. Sam, beside me, he'd come down out of the singer's row. Sam took my hand. My 10-year-old boy took my hand in the dark of that warm room, the way I should have been taking his for 2 years, and held it and didn't look at me, kind enough not to look at me. And I held on to my son's hand and let the song go through me. And it was the worst pain I'd felt since the 9 days, and it was the first thing that had felt like being alive in all that time. And I understood, sitting there, that those are not 2 different things. That the pain was the love. that I'd shut the one off and lost the other with it, that all my stone had ever done was keep me from feeling her and the children from feeling me. I don't recall what I said to Nora afterward, something stiff, something inadequate. I recall she said, "I hope I didn't presume," and I recall I said, "No," and could not say the rest of it, which was, "You gave me back something I'd thrown away and I don't know how to carry it." I think she saw the rest anyway. She had a gift for the unsaid. We rode home through the snow, the runners hissing. I'd brought the sledge, and the stars were out hard and bright the way they only are when it's bitter, and Lucy fell asleep against my side bundled in the buffalo robe, and Sam, after a long while, said into the dark, "Pa, you remember the song?" "I remember the song," I said. "Mama used to sing it wrong." "On purpose," I said, "to make you and your sister holler." Sam was quiet. Then he said, "I thought maybe we weren't allowed to talk about her. You never do." And there it was. There was the whole cost of my coward's plan, laid out by a boy under the winter stars. My children had thought their mother was a thing they weren't allowed to mention, in their own home, to their own father. They'd been grieving her alone for 2 years in silence to spare me, because they'd seen that I couldn't bear it and they'd loved me enough to carry it by themselves. "Sam," I said, and my voice was not steady, "you're allowed to talk about your mother any time you want to anybody you want for the rest of your life. I've been wrong about that. I've been wrong about a lot." I pulled the robe up higher over Lucy. "Her name was Margaret," I said to the stars, the first time I'd said it in 2 years, and the chest thing happened and I let it. "Your mother's name was Margaret Hartwell, and she was the finest person I ever knew, and she'd be ashamed of how quiet I've kept this house. We're going to do better, you and me and Lucy. We're going to remember her out loud." Sam didn't say anything, but after a minute he leaned over against my other side, the way Lucy was leaning, the way he hadn't let himself lean since he decided he had to be a man, and the three of us rode home like that under the cold stars. And I'll tell you, I felt my wife near me on that ride more than I had since the day she died, and it didn't hurt the way I'd been so afraid it would. It was just love, finding somewhere to go at last. So that was Christmas, and if the winter had stayed easy, maybe things would have gone slow and gentle from there. A man thawing out by inches over a season, courting careful, the whole thing taking a tidy year. But the winter did not stay easy. That was the year of the big storm, the one the old-timers still measured other storms against, and it nearly took everything, and it was the fire that finished what the slow thaw had begun. It came at the end of January. We'd had a hard, cold month already, but the morning of the storm dawned almost warm, a yellow fall-spring warmth, and the air had a wrong feel to it that every man in that country knew and feared. I had cattle scattered on the open range north of the creek, and I knew if the weather turned mean I'd lose them in the draws, so I made a hard choice that I have regretted in my bones every winter since. I sent the children to school as usual, because the warm morning fooled me too, and I rode north with my 2 hands to push the cattle down to the home pasture before the weather broke. It broke at noon, and it broke like the end of the world. I have seen weather in 40 years on that range, and I have never seen anything come down like that storm came down. It came out of the northwest as a gray wall, and behind the wall was wind that would knock a horse sideways and snow so thick you could not see the head of your own mount. The temperature fell 40 degrees inside an hour. We got the cattle most of the way down before it hit, and then it hit, and there was no more thinking about cattle. There was only the question of whether 3 men could keep themselves alive. We strung a rope between us and we walked the horses, because to ride was to die, and we made the home place by following the creek by feel, the ice of it under the snow, and we damn near didn't make it at that. One of my hands lost 2 fingers to the frost before spring. We got into the barn near dark, half froze, the horses screaming, and I got the door barred against the wind and stood there gasping. And the first clear thought that came to me through the cold was this. The children were in town, 4 miles off, in a 1-room schoolhouse with a stove that smoked, with a young woman who had not been 3 winters in this country and could not have known what was coming. I have never in my life felt fear like I felt standing in that barn. The cattle, the fingers, my own near death in the draws, none of it had touched me. This dropped me to my knees in the straw. My Bobbies. My Sam and my Lucy, 4 miles off in that white roaring hell, and me unable to so much as see across my own yard, let alone ride 4 miles into the teeth of it. To go out again was certain death and would do them no good dead. To stay was to sit in a barn through the longest night of my life, not knowing if my children were alive. I'll not pretend to dignity about that night. I prayed like a heathen who just got religion. I made bargains with God I had no right to make. I said her name over and over, Margaret, Margaret, keep them, you're closer to him than I am. You tell him, and somewhere in the black middle of that night, with the barn shaking and the cold coming through the walls like knives, I understood the last thing I'd been too proud and too stone-hearted to understand, that I wanted to live. That I'd been half wanting to die for 2 years, working myself toward it, calling it grief and duty, and that I'd been wrong, that there was a whole great deal left I wanted, that I wanted to see my son grow into the fine man he was going to be and walk my daughter to her own wedding someday, and yes, God help me, yes, I wanted to sit at a supper table with Nora Vance across from me for the rest of my natural life, and I wanted to do it as a living man and not a stone one. You learn what you want when you stand to lose it all. That's a hard way to learn it, but it's a true one. The storm blew 2 days. When it cleared on the 3rd morning, the world was changed. All the fences buried and the cattle dead in the draws by the dozen, and I was on a horse and breaking trail toward town before the sun was full up, my hands still useless and my face frostbit and not caring. I broke through drifts to the horse's belly. It took me 3 hours to make 4 miles, and I came over the last rise above Mercy Bend not knowing if I'd find a town or a graveyard. I found the schoolhouse with smoke coming out of the chimney. I will tell you what that woman did, because she never would tell it herself, and the children told me in pieces over the years and the town told me the rest. When the storm hit at noon, she had 31 children in that room and no way to send any of them home. She did not panic, and because she did not, they did not. She barred the door and she banked the stove and she sent the biggest boys, the McCabe twins, the ones everybody called worthless, out on a rope to the woodpile and back again and again, until they'd brought in every stick of wood there was, and she made heroes out of them in front of the little ones so they'd keep going, and they did, those 2 rough boys, half froze, because she'd given them something to be. When the wood ran low on the 2nd day, she broke up the spare desks and burned them. She kept the children singing to keep their spirits up, and kept them moving to keep them warm, and she told them stories all through the long nights, and she let no child sleep too near the cold walls. And she fed them out of the lunch pails pooled together and stretched it with melted snow, and she lost not one. 31 children went into that storm and 31 came out, and the only reason any of them is alive to have grandchildren today is that a plain schoolteacher from back east was tougher and steadier and braver than the whole pack of grown men in that valley, myself the first among them. I came through the door of that schoolhouse like a wild man, snow to my waist, and there in the warm, smoky dim were 31 children wrapped in coats and curtains and whatever there'd been, and Lucy saw me and screamed, "P.A." and came across that room and hit me so hard she near knocked me down, and Sam was right behind her, trying to be a man and failing, crying like the boy he still was, and I went down on my knees on that schoolhouse floor and got both my children inside my arms, and I could not have told you my own name. And over Lucy's curls, I looked up and found Nora Vance. She was gray with exhaustion. She'd not slept in 2 days. Her hair had come down and there was soot on her face, and she was holding herself up by the corner of her own desk. And when she saw me, saw the children safe in my arms, saw the job was done, saw she could finally stop, something went out of her, the iron she'd been running on, and she swayed, and I was up and across that room with my children still half hanging on me, and I caught her before she went down. I caught her, and she put her face against my coat, just for a moment, just for one moment let herself be held instead of holding, and I felt how thin she was through that worn dress and how she shook, and I said into her hair the only thing in the world there was to say. "You saved them, you saved all of them." "I lost the desks," she said, half laughing, half gone, the way the brave talk when the danger's past. "The school board's going to be." "Hang the desks," I said. "Hang the school board, hang every fool thing." I had her by the shoulders. I made her look at me. "Nora, you kept my children alive. There is no thing on this earth," and I ran out of words again the way I always did, the stone-hearted fool, except this time I didn't let it stop me. This time I just stood 2 nights in a barn learning what it cost to leave the words unsaid. So I said the rest. "I'm done being a closed-up man," I said. "I've been one for 2 years, and it near cost me everything, and it cost my children worse. I don't want to be it anymore. And I don't want to do the rest of it without you. There. I've said it badly. I never could say things, but I've said it." She looked at me a long moment, gray and swaying and soot-faced, and the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, and her clear eyes filled. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "this is a terrible proposal. It's the only kind I've got. There are 31 children watching." "Let 'em watch," I said. "Let 'em learn how it's done." And the whole room, those tough ranch kids and town kids who just lived through 2 days of hell, set up a holler fit to lift the roof, and Lucy was jumping up and down yelling something I couldn't hear, and Sam had gone red to the ears and was grinning like I hadn't seen him grin in 2 years, and Nora Vance put her sooty hand against my frostbit face and laughed and cried at the same time and said, "Yes, you impossible man. Yes. Now sit down before you fall down, you've got frostbite." We married in the spring, when the creek ran high with melt and the cottonwoods Margaret had loved came back into leaf. We did not rush from that day in the schoolhouse to the altar. Nora would not have it, and she was right. She said a thing said in the teeth of a storm needs to be said again in the calm of an ordinary morning, by people in their right minds, or it doesn't count. So I courted her honest through that spring in the daylight, like a free man courting a free woman, both of us with our eyes open. I rode in on Sundays. We walked out along the creek. I told her about Margaret, all of it, the singing and the 9 days and the photograph I'd shut in the drawer, and she listened. And she never once acted jealous of the dead, because she understood a thing it had taken me 2 years to learn, which is that a heart big enough to grieve that hard is a heart with room in it, and that loving Margaret well was the best evidence there was that I'd love her well too. She took the photograph out of the drawer herself and set it back on the mantel where it belonged. "Your children need their mother's face," she said, "and I'm not afraid of her. I'm grateful to her. She raised the man I'm marrying." She did not become their mother by replacing the one they'd lost. She was too wise for that and too kind. She became their mother by loving them as themselves, and by keeping Margaret alive in the house, telling the children the stories I'd told her, baking the things I described, even singing the fool song wrong on purpose at Christmas, every Christmas for the rest of our lives, until the grandchildren learned it wrong too, and none of them ever knew it had any other version. That was Nora. She didn't paper over the grief. She built a home on top of it, the way you build on bedrock, and the grief held the weight because she'd made it part of the foundation instead of a hole in the floor. Lucy quit sucking her thumb that spring. I don't think anybody told her to. She just didn't need it anymore. Sam grew up straight and easy and unburdened, and he didn't have to be a man at 10, because there were 2 grown people in the house again to be the grown people, and he got to be a boy a while longer, which every boy deserves and not every boy gets. He's got a ranch of his own now, 2 valleys over and 4 children, and he is the warmest father I ever saw, warmer than I knew how to be, and I take some private comfort in believing that's because he got enough years of warmth himself in the end to have some to give. We got it to him in time, just barely, by the grace of God and a schoolteacher. And me, well, you asked me if anyone's still listening to an old man ramble what changed. I'll tell you the smallest true thing, which is the only kind worth telling. About a year after we married, I was out at the corral on a fine fall morning, gentling a young horse, and Nora was hanging wash on the line, and I heard a sound come through the kitchen window. Except it wasn't the kitchen, It was the yard, and it wasn't Margaret. It was Nora, hanging the wash, singing low to herself the way a woman does when she doesn't know she's doing it. And I stood there at the corral with the lead rope in my hand, and I heard it, and I understood that I was a man standing in his own yard on his own land hearing his wife sing. A thing I'd thought was gone out of the world forever. A thing I'd thought had been buried in 9 days 2 winters before. And here it was, given back to me. Not the same, never the same, but real and warm, and mine to keep this time if I had sense enough to keep it. And I laughed. It came up out of me of its own accord, before I could think about it or stop it or be ashamed of it. A real one, the kind Lucy said I'd forgot how to do. The horse spooked sideways at the strange sound, not used to it, and Nora turned with a clothespin in her mouth and a sheet half pinned, and she looked at me across the yard, and she saw what it was, and she didn't say a word. She just smiled, slow, the way she'd smiled at a thumb-sucking child in a dusty street years before. The smile of a woman who'd set out to do an impossible thing, and against all the odds in that hard country, by patience and by grit and by a kind of stubborn, gentle faith I'll never understand and never deserve, had gone and done it. My daughter once told a stranger her pa had forgot how to smile, and a stranger heard her and crouched down in the dust and decided to do something about it. She taught a one-armed boy to write, that woman. She taught the worthless McCabe twins to be heroes. She taught 31 children to keep their heads in a killing storm. But the hardest pupil she ever took on was a stone-hearted widower out at Coldwater Creek who'd nailed his own heart in a box and thrown away the key. And even him, she taught. She taught me to smile again. She taught me there was no shame in the grief and no end to the love and no rule anywhere that said a man only gets the one. She taught me that a home isn't a roof and 3 meals, it's people warm enough to sing in. I am old now and she is gone these 4 years, and you'd think a man would have learned by now to keep from loving so hard it'll cost him this much when it ends. But I'll tell you what I learned instead, what she spent 30 years teaching me. The cost is the proof. The hurt is the love, with nowhere left to go but through you, and I'd not trade 1 day of it. Not 1 cold day or 1 warm one, to have spared myself this. I say both their names out loud now every day. Margaret, Nora, I keep both their faces on the mantle. The grandchildren ask about them and I tell the stories, all of them, the singing and the storm and the dusty street, and I do it out loud in a house that's never quiet the way it's supposed to be done. And every now and again, gentling a horse on a fine fall morning, an old man in an empty yard, I'll catch myself doing the thing I'd forgot how to do, for no reason at all, just because the light is good and I'm alive and I had them. I had them both, longer than I ever deserved. I smile. She'd be glad to know it, they both would.